at all, but that happens very rarely. So the benefits, again, many different reasons, but I'd say one of the key benefits from a business perspective is cost, and from a technical perspective and ownership perspective is the liberty and ownership that you get on your own technology stack. You're not you're not locked into a rent-seeking environment. You have complete freedom to do whatever you want, especially in the fintech industry where regulatory changes come abruptly and pretty much by the day or weekly. You need full control on the stack. You need in-depth understanding. You can't really be dealing with black boxes that you've put together. So all of these things, Fast ticks all these boxes. You own it. You can change however you feel like. You can swap pieces out. You don't really have to seek anyone's permission. It's all yours. So that freedom and liberty, definitely. And of course, cost. And we've our net, even operating at our scale, our net infrastructure IT spends, it's only a tiny fraction of our net expenses, thanks to us self-hosting FOSS. And I'd say that plays into our agility and also our viability as a business.
Yeah. I think what you're saying reminds me of a presentation I saw from DBS Bank, and they said that they moved from, over the last 10 years, they moved from being about 80% outsourced proprietary software to about 90% in-sourced open source software. So, and they say that their cost structure has come down by about 4%. So, which is significant in banking because net interest margins, etc. So, yeah. I think there's a case study to be written about your usage of open source software. I'll quickly move to Keith. And Keith, over the last 15 years, you've seen this journey of open source, and what is it that is currently kind of driving most fintechs and banks to join the join the open source movement? Keith, you're on mute.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. But in response to your question, Venki, I think all of the points that Klaus made are completely on point. I'd say I'd add one element that it's the notion of collaborative development, that the inherent nature of open source is about creating higher levels of innovation through collaborative development. The whole idea that we build on each other's ideas and creating an environment where this is the modality, the norm in terms of how new ideas are contributed, I think allows for an accelerated level of innovation, and then gives you that flexibility, that adaptability, and the kind of the control of the platform that he talked about. And I think the reason why this is increasing everywhere in the world in financial services is because it's almost, we think about open source is starting relatively recently in financial services, but it's really had its history going back to when proprietary providers would provide open source centric solutions. So the big iron companies would come in and provide solutions 10, 15 years ago that were enterprise-based solutions that were really running on open source. And it was very important for them to have this duality, for them to be able to package a solution. I think what I've seen in the last 5 years, 3 to 5 years globally, is financial services companies, fintechs, all manner of companies involved in data management on the back end to a more revitalized, more customer-friendly interface on the front end, is that banks, insurance companies, financial services companies of all manner are now taking control and emerging as technology-centric. They recognize that they need to hire talent, have that talent actually create, modify, and adapt their own solutions to fit their individual customers' needs. And open source is the critical enabling technology that allows this to happen. And so we went from open source in a box that was less malleable, less fungible, to now having the second wave of open source, where it's becoming so important that when I talk to banks and fintechs, I tell them that in 5 to 7 years, they'll be taping out their own chips. Because open source is a modality that starts with software and migrates to hardware. And so control will extend to an arena that could have never been envisioned, that will ultimately be in a position where these organizations are creating their own solutions, and silicon that they're designing fits that solution, rather than having to use to be subject to the continued hegemony of embedded companies that are delivering off-the-shelf solutions that then we collectively then have to adapt to fit a solution, and it becomes less suboptimal. And so in order to avoid that, this change is occurring that's very significant, that we're very excited about, and are hoping to do the same thing we did for software in terms of creating freedom of action, freedom to operate, and choice, to provide that same choice in the hardware side, particularly as it relates to silicon. And so I think many tech leaders, we talk to CTOs at many different financial services institutions. You look at their roadmap and they talk about where they're going, they see this trend, and they see the opportunity is there for them to re-emerge almost as tech-centric, tech-savvy, rather than eating their food pre-chewed. They're now escaping from the control elements of big box companies wanting to bring solutions in that are fixed and closed, that require extensive support. I think one of the questions at the outset in the survey about support, I have less concern about support than the participants, because I see that the support burden is actually decreasing and the ability to manage networks is increasing when we move to an open source world.
I think it's an interesting point that a couple of interesting points that you bring up. One is that this model seems to be moving from hardware to software to hardware now. The second point is, I think I was reading the CIO of DBS Bank and also the CEO of BBVA, which is of course legendary for usage of technology. And both of them said exactly the same thing, which is that we are a technology company that is now into banking. So I think it just kind of shows the centrality of technology in, I think Nitin, the CEO of Zerodha, also said something similar in one of the interviews that I did with him. So I think it kind of is a very interesting kind of turning point in our in the history of technology. I think we are at a kind of a tipping point where everything has some kind of a technology touch point. Nikhil, let me come to you. You are building out an API marketplace. You are a relatively new, let's say, compared to Zerodha, of course, the relatively new startup. Why do you go with open source? Advantages that you see with using open source software?
Sure. I think just to kind of take off from where Kailash was talking about, I think as technology companies, one of the modes that we can obviously build, which is in our control, is to build better products and better software. And and today, the way software development is being done, right? We can basically abstract that into 3 different layers, right? So typically, what do? You have to build applications, right, to support your business. Now, in order to build these applications, typically, you could choose to write, hundreds and thousands of lines of code the way we used to do it before, or you refer to libraries which help you to build these applications faster. So open source for me is kind of can be thought in these 3 layers. So first is the libraries. And I think this is something that people need to understand how software is even being built today. Nobody writes software from scratch, right? Because, it's those days are gone. There are enough tools, as the internet has grown, one of the things that it's done obviously is, information has become more democratic. So there's a lot more available things. One of them is manifested in this thing called libraries. And these libraries could be anything, it could be about solving a very specific problem for you when you're building the software, or it could be solving a particular feature and so on and so forth. So I would argue even the guys who are building proprietary software are going to be using some open source library to build that proprietary software. So, in some sense, it's a no nonsense layer to use open source libraries in the applications that you build. That is number one. The second layer is the application layer, which is essentially the software that you use for various different, it could be CRM, it could be, the way you build software itself, the way you manage your infrastructure, it could be monitoring tools, it could be analytics tools, and so on and so forth, right? And the reason why, especially in the financial services business, that it's very important, I think another element that I would like to add is because of data localizations, because of regulatory reasons, in some sense, your choice of, you don't really have a choice to use proprietary software, right? The ownership of data, being the custodian of consumer data, you simply do not have the choice to say use a tool which probably takes the data out of the country, and that might actually come under regulatory scrutiny and so on. So there are a bunch of these applications that are available. For example, there is a very popular stack called the ELK stack, which is like Elasticsearch and Kibana and so on and so forth, which is used by any modern software company, right? Anybody, right? It's the de facto standard to use something like that. Similarly, if you are using analytics, which require you to perform data operations on your own customer data or interactions, you don't want your data to leave your infrastructure, go to another company and get into all the regulatory. So you would want to have your own. So in some sense, sovereignty of your data is also a very important angle of why open source is important. So that's on the application level. The good news about all of this is there is a lot of the worry that people have with regard to security and so on can actually be unbundled into an application layer and the infrastructure layer. The security problems are generally around the infrastructure layer. And the good news is that if we are in this world where a lot of the legacy institutions are making their moves into getting into cloud, right? And a lot of the cloud service providers today offer out of the box support for open source software. And I think this is a phenomena that's not talked enough to build confidence. Okay, if you ask us, why do we use an open source software so, like a database or like a ELK stack so easily? Because an AWS, which is our infrastructure provider, provides out of the box plugins and connectors for us to actually build and deploy this and manage it in a super easy manner. So in some sense, I think, with the advent of these cloud providers, which are not like the bare metal guys that used to be before with, your data centers and so on. There's a lot of these managed services that's available. And that's, that can be very well married with a lot of the open source applications that are available and stitched together to, have your own sovereignty in terms of your data, access to different applications and so on. So at our company, like everything, almost our monitoring tools, the way we build software, the framework, the programming language that we use, everything is built on open source, right? So in some sense, if you come to Bangalore and go around, there is, in our hiring, this is the technologies that we ask people or, engineers today to have skills. Gone are the days. In fact, it is a flag for hiring engineers if they're only trained and built on proprietary technologies, right? We want people to come and dabble who are, like these are some of the spikes that you see, like if people have contributed back to open source software and so on, all the way from handling complex things like authentication to infrastructure monitoring, to software development, to the way we store like our databases, everything is open source. And why is this important for a startup like us? Because if we were to invest millions of dollars to buy software to build products, we would never have economies of scale as a company, right? It will never work for us. So in some sense, we don't have $1 billion IT budget. So, so for us, this is the theory of constraint works very well, because, we are now forced to think about how do we build software in the best software in the most efficient and in the most cheapest manner, and obviously, use all the technologies that's available. So this is
Nikhil, both you and Kailash are hardcore techies, so let me ask a question from a non-techie perspective. I think one of the questions that I get from people who are, CEOs, non-techies who are starting off their companies is, okay, I buy the philosophy of open source software. I like that whole model of collaboration, community, and the shared ownership of knowledge. But it's very hard for me to do, because as a non-techie, it's easy for me to, just buy a CRM, get it running, and I don't have to worry about, let's say, tying up different pieces of open source software together. So how do you kind of help them transition? How can they kind of, build a open source culture within their organization? Maybe Kailash can go first and then Nikhil.
This is there's no straight answer to this. There's no formula or blueprint on how to become a tech savvy organization. And one of my personal gripes is that a lot of companies generate monumental waste of resources and money because there are non-technical decision makers making incorrect technical decisions. So that's essentially the problem that's essentially what you're asking. So I would say that choice, making that right trade-off. Do I go with this proprietary CRM and get logged in? Or do I go with this proprietary CRM in a manner where I'd be able to pull myself out, exit at some point? This really requires technical savviness. Not all software choices require, but this requires, a certain kind of long-term vision and planning, which you'll only really have if you have technical expertise. So a fledgling organization that does not have technical savviness, trying to take technical decisions, my view is that they should build some technical capacity. They don't have to have a full-fledged, tech team on day one, but these nuanced technical decisions that will have a bearing on many, many years to come should be done by technical folks. So organizations should, from the get-go, build some sort of technical capacity, at least in advisory capacity. Just speak to people who know what they're talking about, really.
Yeah, so I think this is a point that I think has not been spoken about enough, that of, non-technical people or management respecting and, having a certain boundary or a decision-making framework when, interacting with the technical staff. I think I'm glad that you highlighted that. I see Nikhil smiling, and we discussed.
I think like I was going to start with this thing. I think like the first investment will always be people, because unless you have someone who's next to you who will say, "Hey, look, we can actually," there is. Typically in a good startup culture, whenever you try to choose a software, this actually happened to us just this morning. And, we were trying to figure out, we wanted to use a service to build deep links, right? Like shorten URL links. And, we were using a library, and then, somebody in the team said, look, we should use Bitly, which is a popular software. And then immediately there were a bunch of engineers who jumped and said, look, there is a better alternative. This provides everything, this we can self-host it, and, and so on. Now, you need that kind of people to give you confidence to be able to use. And the only way to do that, especially in large organizations, as Kailash was saying, is to get the right set of people. I think the support angle will not really come from an external vendor. That support needs to be internal, because I think the proxy for that support is conviction. Do you have conviction that this would work? So somebody needs to put their foot down and say that. The second point I wanted to share around choosing the right software, I think is also, a mix of like, what business process or what application problem that you're really trying to solve. Because we have been obviously talking about the goods of open source. The negative of this also is that it does come with this overhead of knowledge and management, which is somebody needs to know how to do this and somebody needs to know how to manage this. And sometimes, especially when you're optimizing for agility, especially, and I'm talking this from a startup's perspective, you will make this decision about, do you want to do this by yourself versus like what will give you agility. For example, like something that we are not proud of, but we are okay with this decision, is we use a CRM and we use support ticketing software from our friends who just IPO'd, right? So and when I was like, should I be happy that look, we are happy customers, we are contributing, and an Indian startup has gone and IPO'd, or should we like looking at like what Kailash has done at Zerodha and like host all of this? And when we try to make that decision, one of the things for us was to calculate what is the cost for us, in order to build and manage this by ourselves versus using something out of the box, especially in a world where engineering resources are, extremely hard to manage. I mean, the world that we are living in as startups, where we are fighting for engineers' time and energy. So for a company like ours, we don't have more than 10 to 15 people interacting with our CRM application at any point in time. So the choice for us to use something out of the box and pay, say, $10 per user per month was a very simple, logical choice to make. Whereas probably for somebody like Zerodha, maybe where there are 1,000 people who are interacting with that particular software, it's a clear no-brainer, right? Why would you want to pay $10 into 1,000 users in a month?
Can I interrupt you, Nikhil?
So
So we install OS tickets, old school open source PHP based ticketing system, and we customized it a bit. We installed it in 2013 when we only had like a couple dozen people logging in. Today we have 1,200 people, but it's the same instance, pretty much the same installation. So that decision was made when we did not really have a lot of people logging in, but it still made sense. And I think there's this phobia towards, there's a strawman, right? The maintenance overhead strawman. I really think for a lot of these cases, in the end, it is really a strawman. So this installation has been running just fine with 20 users and 1,200 users on the same instance with very little active involvement from our side. Developers putting in effort. Maybe we log in once every 7 months to make sure that the disks are fine, or some archival scripts have to be run. That's about it. So that's definitely possible. But I think the thing is, you have 24 users, let's say, on your CRM, and 2-3 years from now, you're growing fast, you end up with 500 users. But it'll be really difficult for you to pull out, because your workflows would have been built on top of that. You'll have data, you'll have sensitive,
Absolutely.
critical data. And the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes. So I just wanted to throw that in there. That
Oh,
it's
absolutely. In fact, when before we started the conversation, when I was like saying like we're learning from Kailash, was one of the things was also to learn from them about one of the tools that which are they using, which is called ERP Next, and and learn and actually implement it for ourselves internally. And this is the problem, like Venki, overall, that the pitfalls about not using your own software or open source is your processes get designed around the software, right? And therefore it is really, really hard for you to move back in or move into something new. So a lot of people who are facing these issues today on making the transformation and this thing is generally because of the fact that the processes are built around the software. The software dictates how your bank should run. right? And this is a classical example that we have seen with core banking systems. In spite of all the things that's happening on digital, banks are still, to the average of what their CBS can deliver or offer to them. And even to the best of us, like, people who are working in the startup technology space, we still have this, little bit of this thing to make that leap. Even though 80% of our software and everything is run on open source, there's this still some element of it which we have not moved yet. And which is why, I think the general discourse, of using software and having some of these case studies is generally important. Because now, where do we get our confidence from? We're like, hey, look, Zerodha is doing this, I think we should also do this. I mean, what is stopping us? And if that reference implementation is not there, for any piece of software, you always need reference implementations, especially in open source world, to say, okay, somebody is using this, and that gives you conviction, and and so on. So that's really where we are. And I think I do take Kailash's point that it's never too late or never too early. So
yeah, I think Nikhil, when we spoke, I think one of the points you made was that even if you go into a proprietary software, you should design your workflow so that you can migrate out of it. So I think that's an important point to leave for this audience. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is by the way, by design of the proprietary softwares, right? Because if you're a product manager in the proprietary software, your job is to not allow your customer to churn out of your product and go somewhere else. So it is by design.
You hook them on, you keep these proprietary hooks so that it becomes very hard for them to migrate out of it.
Correct.
So
correct.
I think we are at the 45-minute mark. So what I'll do is I'll request audience to put in their questions in the chat box, and we'll take some of the best questions. I see that there's already one question from Anivar. I'll come to that but before that, there's one question which I wanted to address to all three of you, and maybe Keith could go first, or Kailash, or Nikhil. The thing is that one of the questions that comes up again and again when I speak to CIOs, CTOs, and is the security of open source software. And to me, this is a bit surprising, because I thought this is a question that got sorted out a while ago. But again and again, the question of is open source software secure? Because the code is open, I worry that it may not be secure. And this is, I think, largely from a non-technical audience. So how do you address that question? How do you deal with it in your own organizations? So maybe Kailash goes first, and then Keith, if you want to add to that, and Nikhil.
I would say that open source security is a bit of a misnomer. It's really technical security. It's really software security. There is nothing that dictates that code which is out in the open under a certain FOSS license is prone to somehow poorer security compared to proprietary software, where you don't even get to peek inside. And if you look at it logically, if something is out in the open and if there are issues in it, it'll be discovered quickly than a black box which relies on security through obscurity quite a bit. And even if someone discovers it, there's no avenue to really contribute fixes back or suggest technical solutions to those problems. And it's all in the hands of probably just one entity out there, the entity that controls the proprietary piece of software. And what they do, whether they really fix the issue or do they sweep it under the carpet, nobody gets to know. It's a black box.
So Kailash, you deal with money, which is, the most critical kind of this. So just at a practical level, how do you deal with security issues? How do you enforce security? Because daily, I think thousands of crores of money is moving in and out of people's accounts at Zerodha.
So that's my point. It has no bearing on whether the software is open source or proprietary. It makes no difference. The only thing it has a bearing on is whether this particular piece of software, irrespective of its source being out there or not, is secure or not? Does it have bugs or not? It's really just that. And coming back to that point, when something is open, there are more eyeballs looking at it. There are people out there who have the ability to study it, figure out issues faster, and everybody gets to know. And if it's a reasonably popular open source project, just by the sheer nature of the system, there's pressure for it to be fixed properly, because if you don't fix it properly, it's still out there in the open, and people can point at the source code and say it's not fixed. By something being open, it's naturally compelled to constantly move towards better security models. It's not that there are no bugs or security holes. There's always in all kinds of software. Just that open source software, there's the tendency to constantly improve, because there's tons of eyeballs, and it's all out there in the open, is far higher than proprietary black boxes where you don't really get to know what's happening at all. And you just have to take the word of whoever is the vendor.
Yeah. Keith, at the ecosystem level, I think there are some initiatives on growing the kind of deepening the security. There is the Linux Foundation's Open Source Security Foundation. Can you speak a little bit about that? What's happening at a macro ecosystem level?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and to Kailash's point, that's really paraphrasing Linus when he talked about all bugs are shallow because of the number of eyes that are looking at technology that emerges from projects. And I think the whole project model is very interesting, and you see more involvement coming from CIOs, CTOs, heads of software, and it's really they perform the bridging function to get non-technical bank leadership or financial services company leadership on board to talk them down from this sense of overarching risk, to have them understand the pragmatism and the reality of what open source brings. All the benefits we talked about, cost reduction, even when they're hiring more headcount, they can also understand that there's actually a cost reduction component that allows them to take control of the future of their technology. And again, something we haven't emphasized enough, it's all about differentiation to the customer. How do we differentiate and keep differentiation? By utilizing open source technology. That's another question that business managers sometimes have, because they don't get the full thrust of open source and how it creates this access to new innovation. And I think there are many projects that the open source world, SPDX, the controlling bill of materials, creating a standard so that there's more transparency. That helps regulators feel more comfortable. It helps users of technology feel more comfortable, adopters. And it gives projects more energy. It puts more air under the tent to be able to allow more participation in open source projects, more innovation to come out, and a better solution ultimately to be fashioned by tech-savvy institutions that used to rely only on third-party information and content and technology. And so there's this massive transition occurring, and the things that are being done to be able to facilitate more effective technology development and management of technology and solutions. You see, things coming out of projects that are focused on utilizing technology that enables security. The blockchain projects that are inside the Linux Foundation and elsewhere. I mean, it's not just, and the thing about projects, they may have a particular situs, a country where they're most associated. Linux Foundation is actually very global now. It's not beyond my thinking they're putting projects all throughout Europe now in terms of their center of operations or where you organize them. There's no reason that more projects from major global institutions like that can't exist and have their foundation in India, in China. You look at what Open Atom's doing. They're founding their own projects, and they'll do it with the support of project management organizations like the Linux Foundation to be able to ensure that there's professional management of projects so that more code can be produced that's valuable. So all of these dynamics are actually coming into play to be able to affect the end result. And security is one of the key areas of focus for many organizations, and certainly for the Linux Foundation.
Thanks, Keith. I think I think the professionalization of open source is, I think, clearly a key trend that is, going to
Venki,
lead
I
to.
just want to add one quick point. It's just funny that even all of our security infrastructure monitoring tools are all open source. I'm just going one step beyond that and saying what we trust to verify our applications and things are itself, those applications themselves are open source because they are the best in class, right? And as Kailash was saying, it's the security argument is really abstracted at an infrastructure layer, whether, and that's why, like even using the right DevOps tools and things like that. And usually, I mean, even just using managed services from cloud providers kind of abstract out those issues. And it's not so much anymore. I mean, what does security problem really mean? If someone's really bothered, that's okay, someone has put a small piece of code that's snooping your software and it is sending data somewhere else, that's really the software, I mean, that's really the only problem we should be worried about. And it counters the point, the fact that all code is available for somebody to read. That is why the community exists. So there is every open source project has, just like how on a, just to simplify this, just like how do you get trust when you buy online, right? You will probably look at reviews. You'll see an Amazon seller's reviews and say, should I buy from this? Similarly, the open source world has its own metrics to say whether this project is reliable, how many people have contributed, how many stars does this project have, what kind of issues, what's the community. So these metrics already exist. So in some sense, the security problem is just a very, easy argument to kind of, like Kailash was saying, it's again a strawman argument to say, okay. And I think one of the things that people should probably realize is everything that we probably use, even Zoom maybe is using some open source software underneath. I think, if we just write an article to say, what are the daily software, or, whether you're using iOS or whether you're using Android, these were all built out of open source projects, so that people actually feel confident that the things that they actually use every day as a consumer is built on top of it. Because the big shift that we're trying to make is to make enterprises use this, right? When you as a consumer, if you're already doing it, I just think that myth needs to be demystified, because nothing in the world is actually built from scratch anymore. So Mickey, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
I was saying that, Android is a completely open source product. Google has been, completely open source, and, I think they're legendary for kind of using, buying Red Hat software and putting it on their systems and scaling it to, millions of servers. And we have not really seen any major security issues emerge out of Google for the last 10, 15 years that I've been using it. So I think I agree, it's a strawman argument. I'm just surprised with how persistent it is in banks and fintech, and it's just very, very surprising to me. So
it's not surprising at all. It goes back to that whole thing about non-technical people making technical decisions. So a technically savvy person would be able to logically look at these things and come at a logical conclusion. But if somebody who's not technically savvy is in charge of procuring enterprise software, or signing a really big multi-million-dollar contract, and they have no technical insights, of course they will. It's again logical that they'll buy into non-technical arguments because they don't really get it. Yeah. So especially with large enterprises, it really comes down to that non-technical people making technical decisions.
Yeah, I think clearly the FOSS community has a lot of work to do in terms of pushing back against this kind of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. One question which I saw in the chat is, I think, is it possible to build a completely digital bank from scratch on open source as of today? Maybe Kailash, you could quickly answer that in 2 minutes.
I would say it's possible to a certain extent. There are great parallels in the stock market world, in the capital markets industry. So I can just quickly derive parallels from there. So there are these central institutions, there are protocols, APIs that are all proprietary. So you can't really build an open source trading platform because it's connected to so many different proprietary protocols for which you have to pay and get license. So it's meaningless. It's not even feasible. But it's actually simpler for banks. There could be a bank with a core banking system which is open source. It could have open APIs. It could also release open source clients, net banking, web apps or mobile apps or whatever. So it's actually easier, and I use that term very carefully, easier to build a full stack open bank than, let's say, a full stack stock market company because of the proprietary nature of all the entities involved here. So yes, theoretically it is possible, but of course it's a mammoth of a task.
I would probably just add these two examples, Venki, which we know in our real life. I mean, especially for the banking industry. And, you know, as you were aware, we used to talk about this at iSpirit. Many of you obviously know UPI and GST, right? It is fascinating to know both UPI and GST is actually built on open source software. The database that's being used for both UPI and GST is actually open source. You know, my answer to a lot of folks within the bank when they would, this thing is like, you know, if the government is able to make this decision to use open source software, you know, why are you behind this, right? Especially with the sensitive nature of some of these applications and so on. If, by the way, if we hadn't used open source in those tools, these platforms would have never scaled. NPCI would have probably never been able to manage UPI from 0 to 3.5 billion transactions in a month if they were using a proprietary database. As simple as that. Their monitoring is on Kibana. You know, these are all open source tools that's available. And I think these are the examples that are closer to, you know, the banking ecosystem that will probably give people confidence that if not your entire application, make a start somewhere, right? Every popular programming language itself is open source today. So if someone's writing code for you, they're using something like that. So I think there is definitely an opportunity to build things, start somewhere.
Nikhil, I have a quick, I see a quick question from Saurasis. He's asking, how often do you customize the FOSS at a source code level for your own particular need? So can you just quickly answer that?
Yeah, so there are been lots of instances where, you know, we have forked and contributed back to projects where, you know, in the sense that we needed a feature and it was not available. This is one type of customization that you could think about. The most popular one generally is you use something open source and you build something on top of it, which is more relevant for you. For example, within Setu, we use a bunch of like open source components, you know, or programming languages, and we have built our own UI component library, which is used for all our, you know, product development across various different things. So it's a layer above the underlying open source framework. Right. I can take another example. Flask, for example, is a very popular, you know, Python-based software development architecture. Right. We have taken Flask and we have made Flask a little bit, stretched it to be a little bit more like Ruby on Rails, which is another open source project. But this is like Flask for the financial services world. Why? Because our Flask projects, when you kickstart, is by default ISO 27001 certified. It is PCI DSS compliant. So we have, you know, so just our engineers today are able to just write a few scripts and bring up bank grade secured, you know, infrastructure and start building applications on top of it immediately. All right. So that's another example of how we have taken FOSS and customized to the domain and the type of products that we are building. One was at an application level and one is at an infrastructure level.
Thanks, Nikhil. To the audience, I would request them to, you know, fill up the feedback form which is there on chat. I think it would help us understand if this session was useful, and, you know, if it was useful, we would love to do more such sessions. And I see that we are almost at the 6 o'clock mark. So what I'll do is I'll hand over the floor to Srikanth, and over to you, Srikanth.
Hey, thank you so much. Have we covered all the questions, Maitri? Is there anything that's still pending from the audience, or maybe we'll keep it open for a minute or two if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask the questions? You can directly shoot audience, and you don't have to type it. If you have exhausted all the questions, there's none, then we'll close it and thank you for the participation. Yeah, but we'll wait for a minute or two.
Could I say something quickly? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Just a random thought. Nikhil, maybe bank grade security as a phrase should be replaced with force grade security.
For sure, Kailash.
that could be a thing, right? I think
absolutely.
If we make it a thing, I think it'll just be clearer to many people who are on the fence.
Yeah, I think honestly, for a lot of us, when we talk about bank grade security, it's basically an Excel sheet with a long list of line items. Okay, compliance. It's actually got nothing to do with security. It is really an age-old practice that's being followed, where there is someone, we have instances where we have gone and taught the certifying agencies on how to look at our code and certify us. We have to train them, because that's how, the industry is lagging behind, because they don't know something very simple as they don't know how to audit a Docker image, for example. I mean, not to throw some technical term, but I'm just saying that we have to go and sit with them and train them to do so. I think, I completely agree with what Kailash is saying, that we, for a long time, we used to say telco level scalability, bank grade scale. I think it served its purposes till the 2000s. Yeah. We are living in a very different era today. And I think open source security should probably be the, this thing, because there's nothing more, when the community comes together and does things. I think it's with this very simple fact that the more people are at a problem, the better the solution is. It's as simple as that, and that's really what open source is, to demystify to people.
So Kailash, I think your point that, is essentially that, we need to reshape the narrative around open source and security. And I think it's high time that we did it, So I look forward to working with you and FOSS United and others on that.
Venkatesh, we have Sachin who has raised the hand. Sachin, you can ask your question.
Hi, Sachin.
Hi, Kailash. Hi, everyone. I'm a fintech researcher at IIT Delhi. So basically, my question is that how do you talk about open source, open API? So is it the ecosystem can be driven through collaborations, like just understanding how the ecosystem will shape in the age of competition? And when we are talking about the collaboration, so how the ecosystem over the time period will shape the fintech ecosystem? I'm talking.
I genuinely think, 10 years from now, we'll probably look back at this video and say, haha, this is going to happen. There will definitely, by default, there will be more people, I think, adopting open source for sure. I think the delivery models for open source might be in some form of managed infrastructure, or maybe in, some value-added products that people are built. But I'm pretty certain that every piece of software that will probably be running will have some open source component to it, for sure.
I think, Nikhil, I'll add to that. Basically, if you look at all the new emerging technologies, whether it's big data, blockchain, etc., all of them are open source from day one. You don't even see a proprietary alternative. So I think increasingly more and more software is being built the open source way. So therefore, I think organizations have two choices. One is, adopt open source tactically, and the other is, take a strategic view and say that, we need to embrace open source, understand the ethos of open source, do proper license compliance, and then, make the most of using open source software. So either you can do it tactically or you can do it, strategically. So I would argue for the latter, of course. So.
And I also think that there will probably be more domain-specific projects that might kick off. So that's the next big shift that could happen. Currently, a lot of the work that's being done is more at an infrastructure or a software building block layer. but there is definitely potential for things to be a little bit more domain specific. And I think, Sachin, that's probably where a lot of collaboration could happen. Like, people could probably build an open source core banking system or a ledger, or a payment system, and, things. These, by the way, these projects already exist. It's not even far. I think it might just become mainstream in the next 10 years. So.
Yeah.
We have Siddharth also raised his hand.
Thanks.
Yeah, he's put a question in chat. Maybe we can take this as the last one.
Yeah, we'll take this as the last one.
So Shrikant, can I say this is Siddharth? I just raised my hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you, guys. It was an amazing session to understand the open source. So just wanted to understand from the banking standpoint. I understand fintechs and these guys are quite fast in adopting the source.
Siddharth, we lost you, but Siddharth, we lost you for a minute, but yeah,
sure.
just go.
So I wanted to know, how do you see any regulatory bodies, getting their foot down and coming out with some framework or guidelines for the banks, because the banks only moves, when it comes from as a guideline or compliance from say RBIs of the world or NPCIs of the world. So do you see any such thing happening in near future? Just a thought.
Nikhil, do you want to take that since you work with UPI?
No, I mean, I generally think they are the wrong people to have a point of view also about it. I mean, with no offense, but in the sense that this is something that they should not have an opinion about. Rather, they should have overarching guide, unless, for example, like a Rebit, which is a subsidiary of RBI, which is working on technical standards, brings together, and puts together and so on. I mean, like a bunch of people together and so on and so forth. I think as Kailash, I would go back to the decision, like the framework that Kailash was using. It's actually a business decision about like how you want to build this. And I don't think regulation is really an excuse to be able to, not do open source stuff. So Kailash, if you were to add to it.
No, I completely agree. It again comes down to technical competence to make those decisions. That said, given the number of high-profile, visible security breaches and hacks over the last 2, 3, maybe even 5 years, everybody understands data leaks and hacks now. Regulators, the big regulators, RBI, SEBI for capital markets, have indeed taken cognizance, and they've been attempting to create technical frameworks. So SEBI has a comprehensive cybersecurity guideline, which is quite all right from a very non-technical regulator. It's actually quite all right. And it was a collaborative effort between SEBI and the industry. And there's one clause which says that if you use proprietary vendor products to run core business operations, let's say a back office system, accounting software, etc., you have to take it and get it certified. It has to get STQC certification. Now that's quite a damning bit of regulation. If you use any proprietary software which is core, you have to get it certified. And that certification process is really complex and tedious. And the clause says that if you have built stuff in-house or you're self-hosting FOSS, you don't need to get the certification. Now that's a great indicator of kind of where things are headed, that proprietary vendors who are core to these financial institutions are not exactly looked upon in a very amicable way by regulators anymore, because they understand things like data localization and ownership of technology within the stack, critical stuff. So that's a very interesting hint, I thought, when that came out.
So I'd like to thank all three of you, Keith, Nikhil, Kailash, for joining us for this particular panel discussion. And I'll hand over to Shrikant for the final last word.
Okay. Thanks. Excellent session, Kailash, Nikhil, and Keith. And thanks for hosting it, Venkatesh. I think we'll collaborate more and then we'll announce in the near future. I think key takeaways are like, basically what Kailash has been out through emphasizing, right? Non-IT guys actually taking the decisions. I think that's something which has to have a major shift. And I think with good banking still with the PSUs and where there are, the role changes keep happening in non-IT guys still leading it. I mean, we are going through some RFP process recently of some banks, and it's like a copy paste, right? And then you miss some lines and you add some lines on your own. And that's where the danger lurks. that one. And I think, yeah, I mean, the shrug of the legacy thoughts that it's, open source is not security, compliant, right? I mean, I think time has proven, it's been proven time and again. And yeah, industry has to come together. I think banks, since they have the larger share of voice, especially in terms of doing the, at least the regulatory part, I think they should not be the stumbling block, but they should lead the way and then make things happen. And I think with Microsoft and all also now embracing open source, I think it's now the time for it. So hey, thanks, fabulous session. Thank you all for joining on a Thursday evening at 6:10. Yep, great evening to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks for joining early morning from the US. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kailash.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
And thanks, Srikanth and Maitri. Bye.